Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Mike, and this is my 2003 Mercedes C32 AMG. Recently, I've been having an issue with the car where under wide open throttle, the car kind of falls on its face, loses all power. After that, when I try to accelerate, it'll accelerate kind of slowly. It just revs really slow, has a massive lack of power. It was throwing a check engine light, which was giving me a bunch of different misfire codes for various cylinders. When I turn the car off, turn the car back on, the problem goes away again until I, stab the wide open throttle and then it falls on its face. Recently, if you've been following the channel, I repainted the surge tanks. And when I did that, I noticed there was a lot of a green gunk buildup inside of the surge tanks. That is a telltale sign of a leaking intercooler. So I'm going to be replacing the intercooler in this video. I did also replace the intercooler pump with a Bosch 010. Try to see if that would solve the problem. I think it's better, but it's still not right, and I'm still having that issue. So over here in the bench, I have a brand new intercooler. I ordered this directly from Mercedes. As far as I know, this was the last one in the States. I don't know if there are more. Apparently there's more in Germany. But this is mounted underneath the supercharger. So in this video, I'm going to go through detailed step-by-step of how to remove the old piece, install the new piece, and hopefully this will solve the problem. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is remove the intake hoses. These just kind of pull back and lift out of place. Do the same thing on the other side. And from there, remove the engine cover. This just has clips that hold it in place. And I'll go ahead and remove this. The next thing is to remove the air boxes. I've got some modified air boxes that I built. The way I've got mine in, they're just going to lift out. The factory ones would lift out as well. And then I don't have my clamps in. See my other video for details on this. And then I just remove this piece. Same thing on this side. There is a vent tube, PCV vent tube along the bottom here, attached to the valve cover. And that just removes like that. All right, the next thing is on my car, again, it's going to be different. I've got a M113K intake snout here, which is just pushed on, so I'm just going to remove that. And then the next thing to do is to remove the surge tanks. There are T30 bolts all along here. And then there's also 2 clamps in the back side, 2 clamps per side. That's a 7mm, and I'm just going to remove, I'll just loosen up those top clamps, the ones that are closest to me here as I'm filming, and that'll allow me to remove the surge tanks. If you've watched any of my other videos, you may have heard me talking about hand tools. I much prefer to use hand tools than power tools. I'm always nervous I'm going to break something with a power tool or strip a head. I just feel I get a lot more control with a hand tool. By the way, this process is going to be very similar for the M113K motors, such as the E55 AMG and CLS55. A couple of other quick things before I get too deep in here. If you're not familiar, there is something called service mode on Mercedes for the hood. On the W203, you press in this red button, which would actually be down here. Press that in while lifting the hood, and that'll allow it to go more vertical like this. And then once you get it to the right position, the red button locks in place. To put the hood back down, while holding on to the hood, press this button and you can drop the hood back down. Also, I highly suggest getting a set of fender covers and using these just to ensure you don't scratch anything up. Okay, so at this point, I've got the hose clamp loosened up really good on the back side. I've got all the bolts loosened up here. I suggest when you remove the surge tanks, just leave the screws in here because there are 3 different lengths. And this way you know where each one goes. And then at this point, you should be able to lift up on it and then pull the surge tank out. And I'll show you the gunk that I'm talking about in just a sec. All right, with the surge tanks removed, you can see I've just taken a paper towel and just kind of put it in here just to make sure while I'm working I don't drop anything into the intake of the motor. Your valve train is basically right in there. And you'll notice there are these gaskets too. If you have not replaced these recently, I would recommend it. There's also going to be gaskets below the blower. I'll show you those once we get to that point. So I'm going to remove mine. And also you can notice inside there all of the gunk. There's a lot in there. And I think that's what's causing, it's like built up in there. I'm going to have to clean that all out once I get the blower out. That is what's causing my issue. You can see how thick it is. It's just nasty. Really restricting airflow, which is raising the intake air temperatures and causing the blower to shut off. That's what I think is happening. And by the way, I am not a mechanic. I'm just a enthusiast to do-it-yourselfer. So, all right, let's go to the next step. Okay, the next thing you want to do is remove the tension from the belt. You don't have to take the belt completely off the car, but you want to get it out of the way of the blower. To do that, this right down here is your tensioner. And it's going to be a 15 millimeter that you put on here. And basically, if you're not familiar with this, once you crank on this, you can see that moving. And then that's going to allow me to remove the belt from the tensioner, which removes the tension from the supercharger. Okay, I've got it removed from the tensioner, as you can see there. And I would actually suggest just leave the belt as in place as you can get it. Otherwise, you're going to have to go online, find a diagram, and screw around with all that. The next thing I'm going to do is, this is your secondary air system, if you're not familiar. In an upcoming video, I will be deleting this because I've got a problem with that also, which is throwing a different code. But basically, I'm going to go through and remove this bracket. I'll pull the piping off the secondary air just to kind of move this out of the way. And then, continue getting to where I can remove the blower. Okay, for the bolts that hold this, if we start with this bracket, these use, people, I hear from referring to these as like a reverse Torx. This is basically what the bit looks like. If you don't have these, definitely go get yourself a set, because if you use the incorrect kind of a socket, you're likely to damage this. This is an E10 and this is an E12. Okay, there's a couple of other bolts here. These are also E10s. I forgot about these to loosen up the secondary air. Now you can remove it here from the pump. Remove it here from these manifolds. And get that out of your way. All right, let's continue on. Little pro tip here, when I'm doing something like this, just to make sure I don't lose screws or can't figure out where they go, I like to put stuff back in the original holes that they go into. Okay, this is what it looks like when you get the idler wheel pulley out of there, the bracket for that. Also, if you're having an issue with your supercharger, if you're not aware, this is called a power plug, I guess. If you're not aware, the supercharger is, I keep calling it blower supercharger, same thing. It is not always on these cars, and it's basically has an electronic switch. This is the power that goes to an electronic switch. We do need to disconnect this because we are going to be removing the supercharger, so I'll go ahead and unplug that. But if you're having a problem with yours, I actually found some mice droppings in the engine bay, and I've also got, if you notice, my coil wires are getting chewed on. Just that little part right there from mice. I don't drive this car a whole lot. I've got several cars, and this sits from time to time, at least a week or two at a time, and maybe even outside. So again, check your wires. If you suspect an issue, you may have mice as well. All right, we'll go ahead and get that disconnected. Now at this point, I can just pull the belt off the blower. And I've also noticed a little bit of dust in here, if you notice. You can see it there. This is a smaller pulley, Euro-charged pulley. And it looks like, I'm going to check my belt because I see some stuff in here that could just be dirt, but that could also be parts of the belt. So I want to check that as well. All right, let me figure out the next part and we'll continue on. All right, to get the supercharger out, we also need to first remove the fuel rail, which is going to be this piece here. This is the main hose line coming in, the fuel line. You can pull the fuse out for your fuel pump and then crank the car, let it run, and basically stall out. At that point, it's just using up the fuel that's in the system. I didn't bother doing that. It's fine. I'll just use a rag, disconnect this, and put it down underneath here to make sure it doesn't get on my painted surface. There's quite a bit of fuel that'll come out. Whatever's in the fuel rail kind of dumps out. So let me go ahead and do that now. Hold up. And I think the way I've done this in the past, and I've done this before a couple times, but it's been a few years. I think what I did in the past is remove the 4 screws, remove this vent line, lifted up the fuel rail, including the injectors, leaving it connected, and just kind of placed it over here out of the way. So let me go ahead and give that a shot. Okay, fuel rail moved out of the way without disconnecting it. So again, what I did, there's a couple of other steps I needed to do. I removed, there's 4 screws that hold the fuel rail in. I also did have to remove this vent hose from the back of the supercharger. It goes underneath the fuel rail. And to get that out, there is this bolt on the valve cover. So that would loosen this up. I also had to pull this out, another vent tube. And to do that, there's 2 clips. You press in on those clips while pulling out on that tube and it'll come out. And you also need to disconnect the wiring harnesses for the fuel injectors. To do that, you squeeze these 2 silver tabs together while pulling on the plug, and that'll remove it from the injector. So that allows the whole rail to come out. Now I don't have to worry about gas getting all over the place and stinking up the place. So, all right, we'll go to the next step. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is remove, I think these are called the manifolds or valves for the secondary air. There is, I believe it's a T30 right there. If it's anything different, I'll let you know. So you want to pull this bolt out, and then there are the vacuum lines on here. There's one going to this one, and that just slides off. Same here, one going here. And one other thing too, before we get into that, you'll notice right down there, you see right in there, let's see if I can, sorry, having a hard time getting in there, showing you. There is a place right there. See that? It's not focusing very well, but it's a lot of times, and you can see it better. See the machine surface right there? A lot of times I see people posting after replacing their supercharger and saying, oh no, I did something, I'm missing a part. That is a gap that is perfectly normal. That is open by design. All right, so let me go ahead and get those manifolds off. Correction, the bolts are a T45 to remove these. Okay, this is what those manifolds look like when they're removed. There is a gasket that's in there, so you want to be careful not to lose that. Also, these are kind of mated. There's only one way they can go. Despite that, I always label stuff just to be driver's side, passenger side, just to be super careful. All right, we're getting close. Next thing, I'm going to disconnect that plug right there on the center of the 2 tubes. Is the, I believe that's the temperature sensor for the air intake. So I'm going to unplug that. You can also pull that module right out if you want. It's just kind of press fit in there. I'm also going to remove the throttle body wiring. I labeled this because I've got an E55 as well. This is the only time Mercedes ever did this, at least on me, where there's 2 plugs that have the exact same socket but go to different places. I don't see that in this car, but just to be safe, I've labeled it. You'll also want to disconnect this hose. This is also part of the secondary air. It's, I think, like a return. So you want to just unplug that. And then I'll go around and see if there is anything else. But I think at that point, we're going to remove the rest of the bolts, and then we can lift the supercharger out of the car. Correction on the intake air temp sensor. There is a little push tab right there, which allows you to unplug it. Those little tabs on the sides, if you clip those, it'll allow you to pull the unit right out of the intake. Also, I forgot there's one other, and I think this is the cam position sensor, or I forget what this is. But there is another plug that's got to be disconnected. You'll see it underneath there, right there where I'm getting the light on it. And I'll go ahead and unplug that. All right, other than the bolts holding the supercharger to the engine, I think the only other thing I've got is the, obviously you got to do your coolant lines going into the intercooler. You want to be careful here. There's an intake. Basically, it's causing a big loop to go through here. And you want to be careful as to which one is which. I've got 3 different size clamps, so something like this, I'll do the largest clamp on top, and then I'll do the next one down lower, and then this is just a vent tube, which I'll also clamp off just to be safe. All right, got my 3 hose is clamped there, and of course I had a drain pan underneath to catch anything that's going to come out. You're going to make a mess too when you go to lift the blower out, because any fluid that's still in the intercooler is going to come out, so be prepared for that. Now at this point, I think I can remove the remaining bolts. This again is where it's really helpful to have like these paper towel wads in here. That was especially helpful also when I removed the bolts for the fuel rail. Again, if you drop one in there, that's a big problem. So you can see there are, I think there's 6 on this, on the M112. So there's 1, 2, 3. Just this one. This stays on the car. This is a bracket to remove the engine. Same thing on this side. This, however, this bracket, sorry about the light there. This one, the bracket's going to come off when you remove this bolt. And then there is that bolt and that bolt. So let me go ahead and get those all removed. Here's something to be careful of I've never seen before. When I pull the fuel rail, the O-ring for the injector stayed in there. So obviously I want to go ahead and pull that out and put it back on the injector. One other thing to be really careful of, I did mention, on your fuel rail bolts, it's easy for me to say, there are 4 bolts. One of them is longer than the other 3. The one that's longest is going to go in this hole here on the driver's side. And if you notice, this section is hollow and it's actually bolting into this piece here. So take good care when you see the way that this is set up, because this is a little bit of a puzzle. Again, I'm about to pull this out. This piece will then come out, and you've got to kind of put it all back together like this to be able to get it back in there. Okay, the bolts that hold the supercharger in, those are a T45, and you'll notice one of them is slightly longer than the other ones. The longest one is going to be, again, the one that goes back in here. And this piece, I said it kind of wiggles out. You don't have to pull it out now, but I just want to show this. What it looks like, because I kind of fought with this when I put the car back together the last time. So, all right, we got that out. Let's get the rest of the bolts. Here's what I do with these. I get them all loosened up. I don't have a magnetic socket, so basically just use a magnet like that. Again, still have my paper towels in there just in case. All right, I got all the bolts out. On the air line for the secondary air, mine's, there it is. This one with a little hook on it, that goes right to here, and it fits in underneath, in between the supercharger and the intercooler, and it can be kind of a bear to fish in and out. And if you notice, it's got a Y, and this other side is attached, so it splits off underneath the blower. I'm going to disconnect it here. This is actually the control valve, I think, and I believe I'll probably go ahead and reconnect this just to hold it together. And now I think I can get this out with the supercharger, and the whole thing kind of stays together more or less. All right, so now at this point, I think I am good. You should be able to, I haven't tried this yet, lift up the blower. And when you go to lift it, I'm going to need a little bit more force on it. It can be pretty tight. So go ahead and kind of break it loose and just take a good look around and make sure you've got everything removed. All right, let me try this again. I'm going to go ahead and just lift on it. There we go. And now you can hear it coming loose. What I'm going to do is lift this up, grab a flashlight, look underneath there, and make sure. The last thing you want is to realize you've got something plugged in that you forgot. This thing is heavy. If you're doing this on an M112, the V6 motor, it can be done with one person, but it's a beast. If you're doing it on an M113 motor, on like an E55, I highly encourage 2 people. I've done it by myself, even on the E55, but it's really awkward the way it lifts out, and it's a bear. Also, you've got this right here is your, your dipstick area for the oil. This is attached to the transmission. This doesn't move, and you've got to kind of work around this to get the supercharger out. So it is not easy to do. So again, I'm going to double check, make sure I've got everything disconnected, and we'll go ahead and lift it out of the car. Disaster avoided. For any of you pros watching this, you're probably chuckling saying, I want to watch this guy lift this out with the hoses still attached. There's an E7 right here. This bracket is attached to the block. So you want to pull this off. This basically is just a plate. And then you're going to be able to lift the supercharger out, because otherwise you're going to be fighting those tubes. Just to be on the safe side with this secondary air, I'm actually going to unplug both of these. I think this one, the one with the blue cap here, is actually the one that plugs into the blower. But I took a picture of them. Obviously I have the video as a reference, and I'll just unplug both. So now at this point, I think I am good to lift this thing out. So let's give it a shot. I think I'm kind of brave filming this part, but let's see how it goes. I do also have a towel on my radiator shroud here, because I like keeping the car nice and clean. So again, you got to work around this oil tube. So let's give it a shot. Here we go. And it's just getting tangled in the lines. Alrighty. A little bit of coolant spilled on the floor, nothing horrible. Alright, here's what the motor looks like, kind of the valley area of the V of the motor. Mine, just so you know, I cleaned this out probably 5,000 miles ago. I had the supercharger off when I painted it, and so mine's really clean. Yours, you know, if it hasn't been out in a while, it's probably full of crud in there. Also, this again is a opportunity to be able to see, if you don't have a borescope, at least be able to see the valves inside the motor. These gaskets, I kind of forgot about them. I did them not long ago, again, 5,000 miles ago, but I'm going to replace them. I go through FCP Euro, so I'll go ahead and order a new pair of those. And they have a lifetime warranty and everything that they sell. So those go bad. If you've got like a lumpy idle, poor fuel mileage, poor power, these are kind of like an unknown thing that a lot of people forget about. So, all right, now let's take a look at the blower off the car. I mentioned the mouse droppings earlier. You can see there's some around. And a lizard. You can tell I live in Arizona. That guy's not doing too well. All right, here is the supercharger on the bench. Again, it's going to leak out a bunch of fluid, so just be mindful of that. I like using this kind of a pan. What I'm going to do next is I've got some 2x4s here. I'm going to take a moving blanket, an old moving blanket, lay it here, and then lay the supercharger on this upside down. That way I can access the intercooler, and I'll show you how to split that and get that off the supercharger. All right, here is the whole assembly on the bench. By the way, I was tracking my time, as I always do, and it took me about 100 minutes, so just over an hour and a half to get to this point. So, and that includes filming and, you know, moving the tripod and all that kind of stuff. So, not too bad, and that's doing it by myself. Notice here, the way I've got this set up, you want to be really careful not to make sure that there's no pressure on the, this is the controller, I think, for the throttle body. So now you can kind of see what's going on. This is our piece here. That's the new one that we need to remove. So basically to do this, we're going to make sure we remove these lines. I'll show you what I do with these. And then there are 4 bolts. You can see those right there. I think those are a T45 as well. And then there are a couple on the front right here. And there's only 2. And you can see them back there. They basically go into these ears right here. Once you pull those off, you're going to find that this thing does not want to budge. The problem is, or the issue is, that there is RTV silicone around this base where the intercooler matches and mates up with the supercharger. And a lot of times that can be a real bear. I've had to come in here carefully with like a 2x4 and lift up on this to be able to break that seal. So, all right, let me go ahead and get going with that. Also, here's the, you want to really be cognizant of what's going on with your lines here for the secondary air. This one, you can see it goes to the other side there. You want to be really careful. And I'm going to, in this video, I'll go through the whole installation process. You want to be really careful not to pinch these. I've seen that, done before. Sorry, one other quick thing. You may have noticed my paper towel wads. They were in here, right, before I pulled the supercharger off. As soon as I got the supercharger off, I put them inside the block itself. So now you can see those in there. And again, if you want a better shot of your valves, everything is right there for your eyes to see. Again, we'll talk about cleaning this up and prepping for the installation once we get the new intercooler mounted. All right, so to remove these clamps, I don't know if these are a one-time use or not. I have reused them many times. I have the tool to be able to put these back together, and I'll show you that in just a bit. There's a short piece of flexible tubing here. What I do is come in here with a small flat blade screwdriver. Tough to do with one hand. Like that, open it up. And now, and again, make sure you take pictures or something so you know which line is which. Mine have been off before, so I'm cheating, and this is pretty loose, and that'll just pull right off. Do the same thing on the other side, and you can see that is the same piece as that. Okay, I've got the 2 bolts removed down below there. Those are a T45, or excuse me, an E12 on those. And then these 4, which are T45. So now at this point, I can kind of crack the seal and get the intercooler removed from the supercharger. All right, I just gave mine a little bit of a tug, and it's cooperating. So again, if you have to, my E55, I ended up having to use a 2x4 in here to try to wedge it up. So you're just going to lift. There's going to be some fluid coming out of there as well. And then it just simply lifts right off of the supercharger. Let me grab the camera and I'll show you what it looks like inside there. Okay, here's what it looks like underneath. Notice again where this, and I'll go back to this video for assembly. Notice the way this is ran for the secondary air. I'm going to be taking mine out and I'm going to get block off plates, but I'll probably still just leave the tubing in there. But here is what the blower looks like. Good old twin screw. It's a good idea to take a look in here for scoring. Also spinning this, listen to the bearings. There are front and rear bearings. There's, if you were to pull this apart, there's a pair, there's like 2 shafts that go through here. And there are rear bearings and front bearings. And then there's a gear assembly in this part. I've never had this apart, and I'm hoping I never have to because it doesn't look like a lot of fun. I've never gotten that deep. But mine appears to be pretty good. Nothing feels loose. I don't hear any, it doesn't sound like, I've had the supercharger pulley bearing go bad here in the front, and that sounds like crap when that happens. This all sounds really good. So, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and get the supercharger out of the way. Then the fun part, let's take a look at just how bad this thing was. Okay, with the old intercooler on the bench, I'm going to go ahead and grab the parts that I need off of this, and we'll transfer it to the new intercooler. Starting with this sensor. I forget the partner. Somebody wants to let me know in the comments what this does. This is going to be an E7, I believe. E8. So I'll go ahead and remove this. Here, I'll show you. Just pull these 2 screws out, and this just lifts off. Pretty straightforward, only one way it can go, so nothing to screw up here. I think there's a little O-ring in there. Yep. You can see it right there. I forget what part this is, but it's known to go bad, and it's a good one of those when you're in there. I think I replaced this one when I did this job the last time. Next, I'm going to remove, I think the easiest way to do this, and get these parts out of the way, is to remove just this one hose clamp, and then this whole thing is going to pop off. Here again is your intake air temperature sensor. And then when I get this thing open, this is where we're going to see the nastiness, because it looks really, really bad getting in there. So let me go ahead. I'll pull this off and come right back. Yuck. I don't know if this was my problem and what's causing my issue, but regardless, this has got to get fixed. So very common on these. From what I understand, there's two types of intercoolers for the M112K motors. Those that leak and those that are about to leak. I'm hoping I made a good decision in buying a new OEM one because the OEM ones fail. This one was made in 2006 and has been sitting on a shelf, never used. Hopefully it'll last. I know that there are some aftermarket options, and I have heard of people even cutting this open, taking the old radiator part out, doing like this is a triple pass, I think, doing a single pass and really going pretty crazy with that. I'm not huge into mods. I've got a pulley, a tune, a little bit of exhaust work. I've got more stuff going into my E55. This is kind of a daily, I don't drive, again, I don't drive a whole lot, but if I have a daily car, this is it. Maybe once a week tops. But check this out, guys. That is nasty. And I'm got to assume that's totally screwing up the airflow, the temperature of the supercharger. Both sides are just totally gross. Totally nasty. So, all right, let me go ahead and get some brake clean carefully. I'm going to take this again. You'll be able to see this here. If you squeeze on this, now you can pull this out. Again, there's an O-ring here. I don't want to get any brake clean in that sensor, but I'll get this all cleaned up really good, and we'll get this and we'll get this other part transferred into the new intercooler. This is what I scraped out of that intake piece. Unbelievable. So this has got to be doing something, I'm sure. Nothing good. Much better. All right, I got rid of all the gunk. I cleaned everything out really good. Used brake clean, just a gentle wire brush in here just by hand, just to make sure I got any residual. I would check your, I don't know what you call these, foam band or rubber kind of gaskets. Make sure they're good and pliable, they're not cracked, you know, otherwise you'd have an air leak. Mine are in good shape. I've got the two sensors cleaned up as well. This one's killing me, man. I can't remember what this is. Mine says Japan on it, so I've obviously replaced it with one that wasn't made in Germany or an OEM with the part number. When you go to put this part in, I just put a little bit of saliva on there. It'll snap into place, and there's only one way it can go, that this harness wants to be pointing out. That'll snap into place. Put the two bolts back in there. Then this I know is the intake air temperature sensor. This has a tab on it. There is kind of a front and a back, if you will. If you notice right on there, there's a little tab. I'm going to look in the car. I don't recall which way this was oriented, but I'll make sure that it's in the correct position. Okay, for this, the air temperature sensor, I took a look, and this tab wants to be facing the rear of the car. So it's going to be like this. And then this is going to snap into place. I have seen these where these tabs on here break. Fortunately, knock on wood, mine clicked in there without a problem. Just squeeze here, push this in, and that should lock in. And you just want to give it a tug, make sure it's good and secure, and you can see the temp sensor right in there. Okay, next piece of the puzzle is to put these rubber extensions back on with the hose clamps. I'll also put the ones for the surge tanks on and get those all prepped and assembled to the intercooler. I'd suggest this too. When you go to mount these two clamps here, make sure this is really good and straight, because otherwise you're going to have potential of a vacuum leak or an air intake leak going into the surge tanks. So make sure that's good and straight. I also went back on my video and I looked at the way the hose clamps were oriented. I'm kind of a freak like that. And I'm making sure they went back the same exact way that they came off instead of being flipped around. All right, the new intercooler all prepped and ready to go. Everything's really nice and clean. Looks like new. No more green gunk. Now, at this point, I realized inadvertently, I normally plan pretty good, but there is a gasket on the C32 that goes in here. I don't think there is one on the E55. I don't know why that is. And then also, people RTV seal this in addition to the gasket. I don't have the gasket, so I'm going to order that. FCP is 15 minutes from my house, so hopefully they can ship from that location and I'll have this stuff in a day or two. But in the video, it won't matter because it's going to be the next thing you'll see. I'm going to replace this gasket, and again, I'll get RTV. I use stuff called the Right Stuff. I'll show you that when I go to do that. And then I'm going to replace these two gaskets because they're questionable. And again, it's while I'm in there, I might as well take care of it. The next thing I am going to do is go through and just clean this area out really good. Clean all the parts, clean the blower. I'm fighting what I think might be a bad belt. I'm getting a bunch of dust. You can see it like here. I don't know if it's a bad belt or if it is the front seal of the supercharger leaking and getting a little tiny bit of oil out there. So I'm going to clean everything really good in preparation for the reinstallation, which includes all the stuff out of here. Obviously, again, very, very carefully, making sure I don't get anything into the engine. So that will take me some time, probably a solid hour or two to get it as clean as I want. I'll get all the rest of the pieces over here clean and prepped. Again, the surge tanks are kind of cruddy from all the junk that was in there. But I like to have everything really nice and clean before I reinstall. Okay, it's a couple of days later, and I've gone through and I've got all my parts all nice and clean. I decided I'm going to reuse the gaskets. These are a metal gasket, and they look totally fine. But I've got everything else really, really clean. The blower on the underside, all the air intake areas here. Went through it with a fine-tooth comb. Obviously, my intercooler is all good to go. Here's the rest of my parts. And I've literally gone through and cleaned every single piece so that I'm ready for reassembly. I also cleaned out the engine bay area very carefully. And I've got that all good to go. So at this point, what we're going to do is start the reassembly. And that will begin with mounting the intercooler to the blower. All right, so here I've got the blower flipped upside down with the throttle body kind of hanging off the edge here so it lays nice and flat. I've got my gasket and I've got the intercooler. I've also taken the secondary air line that goes from the back of the blower and fished it underneath here. Again, this is a heck of a lot easier to do now than after you get the blower in. It can be really hard, especially if you do an M113K, it's brutal. Now, with regard to this gasket, there is only one way this can go where it lines up and sits properly. So you want to kind of get that figured out. This might be a little bit controversial, but what I do, and somewhere I saw somebody rebuilding one of these, and they used a very small amount of RTV, so I'm going to do the same. I did this the last time, and I didn't have any issues as far as I can tell. So I'm going to take this stuff. I use the right stuff, and I will put it on the supercharger itself, lay my gasket down, put another bead over the top. And then from there, we'll just go ahead and lay the blower, or the intercooler on and get it all bolted in. I actually thought it would be more practical or logical to apply the RTV directly to the backside of the gasket. So that's what I've done, and that gives you an idea of how much I use. Just enough that when I seat the intercooler, I've got a really good seal there. All right, so now I've got my silicone on the gasket. Now it's just a matter of taking this, the intercooler, and gently, let's start at the back, get the two little ears, and then lay it onto your gasket. This way you're not going to be pushing your gasket all over the place. You notice I didn't have to do anything there. Now we'll just go ahead and install the 4 bolts here and the 2 bolts that go here, and I believe it's 20 Newton meters is the torque spec, but I will check that as well. All right, from what I could tell online, it looks like 20 Newton meters is the torque spec. It feels about right when I torqued it down. I would suggest doing these 2 bolts first because they're going to kind of dictate where this lands this way. I've already torqued those down, so now I'll just go around with my torque wrench, and I'll do these other 4. I would suggest doing these in a cross pattern and then getting them torqued. Double check my torque. I don't have a fancy torque wrench that beeps, but it's a Tecton, so it's a good wrench. Okay, we're done with that. On to the next part. Okay, the next thing I would do would be to hook up the 2 coolant lines that are the intake and output for the intercooler. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I have the tool to reuse these clamps. If you don't, I would assume you can just use hose clamps, but a while back I got this tool. So let me show you how it works. Now, also, you want to make sure you're putting the correct line in the correct place. I went to my photos just to be safe. So this is going to go on this side, and then this one. And I also make sure that when I put the clamps back on, they go the same way as the other clamps in terms of, you know, if they go this way or this, whoops, that way. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so now I've got those on. What I would also do is kind of get these, if you recall, when these are in the car, they kind of are stacked like this. You probably want to try to get these kind of aligned as best you can now, and just in terms of spinning them this way. In other words, you don't want to have it like this and put the clamp on. You'll be fighting it when you're getting it back in the car. Now, in terms of the tool, this is it. It's just a set of pliers specific to these clamps. And basically the way that these work is, I'm going to remember here. Hang on one sec. Okay, so sorry about that. My wife was coming in the garage. So with my pliers, I'm going to go in, and there is kind of a way that you want to do these. The thinner side of the pliers goes on the far side of the clamp. And then you just take these, and I'll line up my clamp to make sure it's in the right place. And then when you get this reattached, you also want to be careful too, especially on the M113. You don't want this to be rotated because it'll hit the block going in. And then you basically just go like that, and it'll lock back in and restore the factory connection. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so when you're done, that's what it's going to look like. There are my two tubes lined up very nicely. And then I've got the other side done as well. Okay, at this point, we're going to prepare the engine to reinstall the blower. This is probably the hardest part of the whole job. And again, I've done this 3 or 4 times on M113s and M112s, so there's a few tricks that I think will be very helpful, hopefully. All right, so first off, obviously, again, I've cleaned everything really, really good. I've also removed the paper towels that I had in there to protect just in case anything fell into the motor. I also took, if you've got your secondary air line, I find that setting this in here now is way easier than trying to fish it in later. I've got that set. I've also got everything kind of pushed out of the way. Notice like that air vent, hose, everything is out of the way. My injector wires are out of the way. I've got everything really kind of clear of the entire area. Now, let me show you the next part. Let me show you this real quick too before I forget. If you're doing an M113K, which is very, very similar, except for you've got, I think it's like a secondary, it's almost like a secondary throttle body that's down in this area. There's a gasket in there. That O-ring gasket, replace that if you're going to get it apart. Those always go bad. Mine was actually rolled from the factory. They kind of had it rolled and then put the two pieces together, and I had an air leak from day one. And that's where that second harness goes in too. If you recall, I was talking about the wiring harness, and I said there's 2 harnesses that have exactly the same plug, but they go to different places. That's only on the M113K motors. What I did here, this is kind of helpful. It's just a piece of, I think it's 1-inch stock. Yeah, 1-inch, just square steel. And I effectively made a handle. Basically, I forget the size of the bolts, but there are 2 on the top of the M113. There are 2 threaded holes. These line up with the threaded holes I put bolts in. My wife grabbed one side, I grabbed the other side, and taking the blower in and out was a piece of cake. So just a hopefully a helpful little tip there. Okay, the next thing I would do is identify the placement of your gaskets. These 2 gaskets, which again, I would definitely replace if you haven't done it recently. These are a big source of leaks. Mine are less than 5,000 miles old, so I'm reusing them. You'll notice also you've got your secondary air hole here. What I would do is get those figured out as to where they go. Again, this is, it could be controversial. I do a very small amount of RTV on this surface and also on the blower. So, or again, you could do it on the gasket itself. So let me go ahead and get that prepped. All right, applying the RTV to the gasket on the bench is a lot easier than hanging over the engine bay and doing it there. So that's all you need to do. Just, again, some people may freak out when they see this. I just do a light coating of RTV. Now I'm going to flip this over because it's upside down and lay it on the motor. And then I'll do the same thing on the blower mating surfaces on both parts. And then I'm going to show you a trick which I came up with, which hopefully is the coolest, best part of this whole video. All right, so that's what the RTV looks like on the blower. Got that all prepped. And then I've got the engine bay prepped as well. And here's my cool little trick. I figured this out my own. I'm sure probably other people have done this as well. When you go to put the blower on and you've got your gaskets, everything wants to slide all over, and it's a royal pain. So what I did is I got some threaded rod that's M8 by 1 1/4, cut it into 1-inch chunks. I've got 4 of them in there. And then I took a cutoff wheel and I cut in a groove, which I can use a flathead screwdriver to remove those. But now I've got 4 really nice alignment pins. My gaskets aren't going to move, especially because I'm a weirdo and I've got silicone. That would just make a huge mess. Because again, when you go to lower the blower in, you got to lower it and then scooch it back out of your oil tube, out of the way of the oil tube, and then drop it in. So with that, let's go ahead and lower the blower. All right, this part sucks. I'm doing this by myself. If you're doing an M113, I did it once by myself, and I'll never do it again, which is why I built that bracket. This one isn't as bad, but still completely sucks. So, wish me luck. Let's go ahead and get it. Getting too old for this. All right, when you go to drop it in, again, make sure all your, there we go, boom. Make sure all your lines are out of the way. If you notice there, it was tough to see, but you got to kind of snake it around the oil dipstick tube. But with these alignment pins, you heard it, the thing just dropped right into place. Now, before I start putting bolts in or torque anything, I'll run around and make sure everything is out of the way. And I'll also get all of my lines ran. Let me show you real quick. All right, there she is. And again, you can see my little alignment pins. Those are in there. And I'll use a magnetic tip to get those out, so pretty straightforward. But now I would go in and plug in your lines. Now look at how nice that is, having those lines right there. So it's a piece of cake to do. Fighting the blower, you know, trying to run those afterwards sucks. And if you notice, I had this one plugged in already. So that one's good to go. I would also make sure all your harnesses are kind of in the right spot so you can plug them in. And I'll show you that in just a bit. And then in my case, I've got the RTV, which is a fast dry, so I want to start getting my bolts in and get this torqued. All right, I'm actually going to just plug in all my harnesses and get everything good to go and then put my bolts in and torque them down. So in the back of the, turn the light on here, in the M112s, there's 2 wiring harnesses. One goes into your temp sensor, again, back in that plenum right there. And the other sensor, which I still never figured out what it is, but it's right there. And then you also have this vacuum line here that's going to plug in. And then we also have that line, which I'll deal with in just a moment. And then you have your secondary air. Again, these tubes are going to go in, and I'll do those in just a bit. And then these 2 are going to go in, and then you have your power plug for your supercharger. I just realized, too, my clip is broken. I'm going to have to do something here to MacGyver this for now, at least, and then I'll have to order a new plug or do something different there. But that should be it as far as the plugs and things like that. And then we can start putting the bolts in. It felt like I was forgetting something. The throttle body harness, remember the one I put the tape on because I thought there might have been 2? Again, there's 2 of these plugs on the M113. This thing was laying down kind of underneath on the transmission housing, and I was able to easily just lift up the blower and kind of get it fished back up. So another reason why you want to do these harnesses before you get everything torqued down. All right, you want to pay attention, unlike I did. I had to redo it. This hard line right here, that goes to the passenger side of the blower, that plugs in right here, this just pushes in. That needs to go underneath this line. This one's really tight to get in. So just be careful of that. And then once it's set, it should look like that. Now I can still get the surge tank in there okay. All right, at this point I've got my hoses, especially I'm concerned at this point about the back of the blower, so it's really tough to get the stuff. So I've got the two harnesses plugged in underneath. I've got this harness for the throttle body. I've got the two vent tubes. Everything is good there. And then over here I had to fashion something there to make sure that's not going to go anywhere. But I've got my blower plugged in. I've got my secondary air lines right where they need to be with, you know, there's some slack there so they move around. So now at this point, I'll go ahead and very carefully remove the threaded studs I put in, put all the bolts in, and I'll torque those. And I believe I'll look it up to, I think it's 20 Newton meters on those two. And I'll show you the way you've got to do that little wonky one in the back. Something else. Oh, if you're doing an M113K, notice the ears right here, how close they are to the valve covers. Run the wires now for the injectors, because it's some of these you can't get the wire through here and it's a bear to fish it, so it's easier, especially if you need to move the blower to do it. Okay, I've got the alignment studs out, and again, I would start with this bracket. It's pretty self-explanatory. When this goes in, I don't know if I can do this with one hand. Yeah, let me pop this in and show you what it looks like when it's back in. I really hope you watch this in entirety before you go to do the job. That bracket, I forgot on the M113, you can actually just leave it wedged in where it is. It might fall out when you pull the blower out, or you might grab a hold of it and, you know, drop the blower. But that piece you can slip in there before you put the blower into the car. And notice, just for safety purposes, I've got my paper towels back in the intakes just to be safe. All right, when you mount the blower, don't forget the longer one is the one that's going to go in that little bracket that's got the engine hoist hook. I'll show you. This bolt, longer bolt, goes right in there. All right, when you go to put these bolts in, some of them can be tough to get in where they go because there's kind of just a little tunnel for them. I don't have a magnetic Torx. And this again is a T45. What I do have is a whole bunch of Dynamat. I've got another car you may have seen on my channel, that car there, that has about a mile of Dynamat in it, which is basically butyl rubber. So I took a little tiny piece of the butyl rubber right there. I'll put the bolt in like that. And it's just enough for the bolt to be able to hold on to it like that so I can get it mounted. And then I'll show you, give you an example. It's got to go in that hole. Nice and simple. I just drop it in and thread it. Again, I mentioned this earlier. Personally, I do not use power tools when we're working on cars in general, but especially motors, because if you cross thread something, you're screwed. So, all right. Okay, when you're putting the rest of the blower bolts in, I would do the two secondary air. Again, I think those are called manifolds. There's only one they can go, but again, I labeled mine driver's side, passenger side, just to be careful. And don't forget the gaskets. And when you take this apart, I think these bolts are the same length, but again, I kept these bolts with the secondary air pieces. One other really important thing I didn't mention, when you've got the supercharger out, it's a good idea to change the supercharger oil. There's an oil in here. I just checked mine, and mine's good because, again, I did it less than 5,000 miles ago. This is the, just like an Allen. It's a 5mm Allen here. Pull this out. When you've got the blower out, you can just drain it. It is Jet Oil 2 from Mobil, and you want to use Teflon for this piece. There's videos online about how to change the oil. It's pretty straightforward. So, but again, good thing to do when you've got the blower out. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is reinstall the fuel rail. What I would suggest too is on these, there's like a rubber O-ring on these. I take a little tiny bit of grease and just put it on the O-ring. And this thing is going to be my nemesis. I did need to pull this back out because the fuel rail kind of tucks underneath this piece. So you'll kind of see the way that it goes. And then don't forget there's the 4 screws that hold the fuel rail in place. Okay, here's my final answer when doing all this. I forget how much of a maze this whole thing is on this car. Similar on the M113K cars. Here's the order of operations I would go at this back area. I would do this vent tube right here, which is the same as this one. It's one long tube, it goes underneath, and it plugs in down kind of where my middle finger is here. It's really hard to get to once you've got the fuel rail in. So I would do that, then I would put the fuel rail in, then I would do this vent tube, then I would do this vent tube. Make sure also that mine came unplugged right here. Make sure it gets plugged in and make sure to put the bolt back in the valve cover. And again, when that is plugged in, it goes right in there into the supercharger. But taking a good look, again, I suggest maybe taking a whole bunch of pictures of this area in terms of the routing of where everything goes. But now you can see my wires are plugged in to my injectors, and I can easily get the screws in there. I'm not fighting anything, nothing's bound up, and nothing's going to get in the way of the surge tanks. So onward we go. I'll get the 4 screws in for the fuel rail. Fuel injector rail screws. One of them is longer than the other 3. This one goes in this back area right there on the driver's side. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is reinstall the serpentine belt. I think that's probably the next most logical thing to do. If you're unfamiliar with the way it routes, you can look online for a diagram. There's only one belt on this car. If you're dealing with an M113K, there are 2 belts, one separate one for the supercharger. This is also a good time to check your idler pulleys to make sure that they're spinning freely, their bearings are good in those. On second thought, I'm going to hook up the coolant lines just because my wrenches are in the way trying to run the belt. Don't forget that you want to label these or determine which one. I consider these to be top and bottom. The top one I've got different size clamps, and I just did a bigger one on the top. That way I know. And don't forget the vent tube also. Okay, with all 3 hoses hooked back up, don't forget to put the screw in for this little backing plate, and that'll hold everything nice and tight. Okay, the belt is back on. Couple of things with this. Don't forget the belt's got to go over the top of this pulley. Make sure you torque both of these down before you put the belt on using the tensioner down there. Also, one thing I always do is once you've got the belt on, and I was that guy. I had to pull up the diagram on Google to find the correct running of the belt. Double check every single place that the belt touches to ensure that the belt is on there properly, especially on back over in this corner. It's really tough to see your power steering pump and your AC compressor down there, and make sure that mine was off by like 1 rib, and it would have been, probably would have just thrown the belt is my guess, but always be careful of that. All right, from here, now we can do the secondary air, get that buttoned up, and we're really close to the end here. Okay, secondary air is all set. So again, just to recap, you've got this vacuum line is going to go up here. The longer one of these with the yellow tube goes into this. I think this is a switch. And again, you just want to make sure everything is plugged in good. The blue one, the one with the little blue item there, goes right in here. And then this one's going to come up here. And again, running this, the way you saw me run this tube before I installed the blower is so much easier. I've fought with this thing in the past for a long time. Then you've got your main line for the secondary air. This just pushes in, but this is the motor. You've got a bolt here, and then these 2 lines just push in. So basically that is that. The next thing we're going to do is the surge tanks. And to do that, obviously, I'm going to remove those paper towels. Okay, here's a little bit of prep I would do before doing the surge tanks. There are metal gaskets here as well. Again, I just replaced mine. These I've seen where these kind of bend and it screws up the alignment of where the holes are. So you may want to kind of tweak those. Also, at this point, I've pushed my hose clamps onto the intercooler intake right there. You can see my 2 hose clamps. So nice and loose, and they're not going to bind anything up, and they're prepped. I also take just a little tiny bit of grease and just put it around this area just so when I go to pop it in, I don't have to fight it. I mentioned earlier, too, to keep the bolts in. On the M112, it's really pretty straightforward. There are 6 long bolts total. The longest ones, and there's 4 medium size and 2 short. They're basically going to go shortest bolt to longest bolts. If you're dealing with a M113K, it's a little bit different. There's one on the driver's side that's kind of weird the way it lines up, but that's a whole separate thing. So I will go ahead and get the surge tanks in, get the bolts in. I think it's 8 Newton meters is the torque spec. I normally do these by hand because I'm terrified of breaking these, and I've heard of that happening. I'll even put some anti-seize on here a lot of times just to make sure when I'm taking them back out I don't crack them. So with that, let me go ahead and get the surge tanks on. Okay, once you've got the surge tank in place, first thing I would do is go around, and I just use the socket itself and just get them started by hand. I have found in the past that this can kind of be a bear to do. I definitely would not do this with any kind of an impact or a power tool. Because I find that it can be tricky to get them started. So just get them all started. Sometimes you got to kind of wiggle the surge tank around. Get them all started. The passenger side, I've already got all of those hand tight. And then, so now these are all starting. Go around, get them torqued down, do them kind of in a crisscross pattern. And then once you've got everything done, then don't forget to tighten up the hose clamps in the back. Okay, surge tanks are all good. Now I'm going to install the air box, both the air boxes and the main air, kind of a plenum there. Again, mine's going to be different because I'm using the modified one that I built for the off the E55. All right, got everything back in. I don't have the engine cover on because I'm going to start the car at this point. I've got to monitor the coolant level. I got to bleed the coolant in. I'm not going to go through showing how to do that. There are plenty of videos out there, but you do want to bleed the coolant so you don't have any air because you're going to have a big vacancy from the intercooler being out of coolant. But let's go ahead and start the car up. Hopefully everything goes well. Cross fingers. All right, car runs good, and just wanted to kind of close out the video. The blower does sound a bit loud, and it always has, though. I've owned this car. It had 58,000 miles when I bought it. I sold it and bought it back 3 times, and I've put about another 80,000 miles on it. It's got about 142, I think, give or take. The blower's always sounded loud on this car. And if you remember, when I had the blower off the car, I spun it by hand. The bearing sounded fine. Nothing sounded nasty. So, I don't know. I've got a buddy who knows more about these cars than I do. I'm going to check with him. In terms of the total time, this took me about between 10 and 11 hours total from, the car being like this all the way through this entire video, what you saw. But probably 2.5 to 3 hours of that was me cleaning. I cleaned, and I'm really kind of a nut. So I cleaned all the parts. I used hyper dressing on all the plastic, and really went through it and got it nice and clean. But hopefully this was helpful for you. Again, very similar process if you're doing any of the M113K cars, very similar. But again, hopefully it was helpful. And I hope you enjoyed the video. So thank you very much for watching. If you have not already, please like and subscribe and tell your friends. And be sure to be watching the channel for additional content on the other cars that I've owned. Thank you.